Okay, this is your video for Jhumpa Lahiri's The Namesake. This book we're going to be covering over 2 weeks, so this video today will be just an introduction to Lahiri herself and the first part of the book. We're shifting away from the last couple books where we've looked at Latin American immigration to the United States and focusing on a different part of the world, different part of the cultural immigration scene in the 20th century. Lahiri is a relatively newer voice in American literature. She made her debut in 1999 with her short story collection, The Interpreter of Maladies, which won the Pulitzer Prize in 2000. Her first novel, which was The Namesake, came out a few years later, 2003. And it was made into a movie in 2007. That's the movie that I've linked to on our Blackboard page, which if you haven't checked it out, the quality is not great. It seems to be some sort of, I don't want to say pirated source, but it's some sort of suspect source. I wasn't aware of that before I looked into it. So just be aware of that going in. It's formatted strange on the screen, so you're able to see the majority, but there are parts at the beginning where there are translations that are cut off at the bottom of the screen. I don't know. And then she wrote short stories and novels in between that time. 2013 she had another novel that she produced called The Lowland, which was up for the Man Booker and National Book Award in that year. Did not win, but it was really sort of cementing her as a very serious writer in our time currently. She was born in London in 1967. She moved to the United States with her family when she was 2 years old, and her parents are, of course, from Calcutta in India, and are really sort of the model for the central couple in the novel, The Namesake. She grew up in Rhode Island, but her mother, like the mother in the book The Namesake, wanted her and her siblings to have their heritage sort of reinforced, so they would spend an awful lot of time traveling back to India, and summers and other long periods of residence in India when she was a child sort of reinforced her mixed heritage as she was growing up in the United States. When she first went to school, her teacher and principal were sort of puzzled by her name, and sort of mirroring what happens in the beginning of The Namesake to our main character. They decide together that they're going to use her pet name, which is Jhumpa, rather than her given name, and see if I can pronounce this correctly, Nilajana. And they just professed that this was too difficult to say, and it produced this desire to sort of soothe over any ethnic interrelations that were problematic, and so they said, we will call her by this name. Lahiri herself goes on to talk and write about this, and she remembers being embarrassed by her own name. It's discomfort that it would bring to other people. This idea that who she is titled could bring about a certain amount of ill communication, that it could produce in others a block or an obstacle towards getting to know her, the person. And so she remarks about this as being an embarrassment for her. This is something we might see carried out in the main character, Gogol, in The Namesake. He certainly harbors many of those same attributes that are locked up into this idea of his name, and we'll get to that some more in a little bit. Lahiri went to Boston University for many different advanced degrees. She has 2 MAs, an MFA, and a PhD. She would go on to teach writing both at Boston University and at the Rhode Island School of Design. And eventually, when she began to write more on her own, she and her family, her husband and children, moved to Rome, where she currently lives. She currently lives in Italy right now, and she continues to write. She's got a good, productive career. She writes pretty regularly for magazines and working on longer forms of writing. She's also been involved in some television screenplay and was involved to an extent in the production of the film version of The Namesake, which was, as I said, produced in 2007, starring Cal Penn. But she's also, and I've made a link to this article that you can find, professed to write, from at least for the near future, only in Italian. And she wrote an article about this at the end of 2015, that she wrote the article even in Italian, and it was translated into English for the New Yorker, and it's called, I think, Teaching Yourself Italian or something to that extent. And I've linked to it under our folder for this week, so you can check that out if you'd like to. Just a little bit more about her writing career. She makes her debut after being rejected for several years, like most writers. Makes her debut in 1999 with The Interpreter of Maladies, which is a collection of short stories that would go on to win her the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction, which up to that point, and still currently to this day, short fiction collections are typically not winners of the Pulitzer Prize. Usually it's the longer form, so this was an exception. These stories look at issues facing Indian immigrants over different circumstances, and some of the themes that she looks into have to do with marital discontent, something that we see at the beginning of our novel, Ashok and Ashima, experiencing some discomfort because of their different immigrant statuses and their different immigrant paths and that sort of thing, and the way that they're meant to negotiate these is sort of the motivation for the beginnings of our story. We might see it later in the novel as well, and I'll talk about that next week, some of the problems that resurface in different forms in the ensuing generations, children of these immigrants, so on and so forth. She talks about family in these stories, just in general, the way that family sort of is remodeled and re-centered around community for many of the Indian immigrants. We see that in The Namesake as well. And the way that the disconnect, much like in Kingston's The Woman Warrior, the disconnect over the geographical distance sort of drives the idea that family must be recontextualized for the new world, for the new life that is the new normal, so to speak. And we're going to see many of these same things revisited in our novel. And then this elemental theme that we've looked at in several works in our class so far, the generational gap, right? The idea here that we see played out in our novel is played out in the many stories of Interpreter of Maladies. The disconnect over first generation and second generation, this is something that she touched upon in this writing when she debuted in 1999, and might have more arguably fully realized in the 2003 novel that we're looking at, The Namesake. This novel, published in 2003, as I say, focuses in a more extrapolated, long-form look at the children of the Indian immigrant, the first generation to the United States, and that major gap in culture, even as its attempt to be combated with, immersion in their heritage, right? There are trips, and I'll only go so far as to how you're going to be reading. There are trips to India that are meant to sort of stir up in Gogol and his sister Sonia an acquaintance with their heritage that's not to be forgotten. And this is, certainly not just unique to Indian American culture, but it's played out for us here in a way that's very particular to their situation, and situations that Lahiri herself would have seen in her family and in her friends. We have a higher educated individual in Ashoka, and who's navigating the university system and all the institutional literacy that goes along with that system, but yet is very much still a man, an immigrant living on sort of a marked upon community in the United States, and he still has ties to his upbringing and to his world and to his family. And his offspring, the product of he and his wife Ashima, who is also traditional and also very much shocked by the American cultural scene, their offspring are sort of set adrift between these two worlds, and almost, we might argue that they almost rush headlong towards one so they don't feel in that no man's land, so that they remain there as little time as possible. And that sort of is the impetus for this push towards a generational division, right? Even though there's love and there's respect and there's many different types of communication, most of it is sort of driven a wedge between by this full-on desire to be seen as American. She continued writing after this. As I mentioned, she wrote and published the novel The Lowland in 2013. And in 2015, as I mentioned, the last thing that I've seen from her currently written was this article in the New Yorker in which she says she's now only going to be writing in Italian. She's making this cautious effort, and if you read the article, it's a fairly quick read. You can see what it is that she's doing to sort of really, really cross many, many figurative borders and look forward in her life. She's relatively young. She was born in 1967, so she recognizes that her career, not just her career, but her life, have a lot left in front of her, and she's defining for herself the way that she's going to speak about that particular perspective. Shifting a little bit more to her writing, the themes that we're going to see, the focus. Obviously, she's writing about her own experience in some ways. It is much more autobiographical than it is complete fiction, although it is a fabrication. She is navigating cultures and values of different nature between a homeland, like India in her family's case, and an adopted home. And we see that the main character, especially in the beginning of the book, after the focus shifts from Ashok and Ashima to Gogol, the main character is set upon defining that adopted home of his family's as his own home, because in reality this is the only home that he knows. He was born here, he is American, he is of Indian heritage, but his sort of tie to that is only put upon him by his parents, and to sort of navigate between the two is a struggle that he is very much resisting in the early parts of the novel, especially. Trying not to give too much away, what Lahiri is really adept at in this novel and in her short fiction as well is getting at that sort of psychological, introspective conversation that takes place within the character's perception of their existence. Okay? And so the immigrant and the immigrant's offspring certainly lack a connection in a lot of ways, but what we hear here in this novel is the second generation's ongoing psychological negotiation with his sense of self. And again, it seems like we refer back to Mary Pfeiffer in a lot of ways, and if you remember, Pfeiffer's one of her main focuses is to get at what is the psychological status of newcomers to the United States. And if she's looking specifically at refugees, I think it's applicable to immigrants and second generation as well. What is their outcome psychologically speaking? And there's a certain amount of self-hatred directed at his name, at his family's sort of differentness, that defines who he wants to be and who he does not want to be, speaking of Gogol here. And it's all sort of wrapped up in that name. It seems very silly to him. And it's played off, especially after he advances into adolescence, as this very silly and overly personal and almost shameful cultural trait exhibited for everybody. And early on, there's a big distinction made, much like in Lahiri's real life, between pet name and good name, as they say in the book. And that whole scenario in which his good name is, I don't want to say it's sort of prohibited from reaching him, right? The circumstances surrounding their grandmother's naming suggestion being all fouled up by death and lack of communication and lack of understanding of what was required of the U.S. cultural systematic requirements. All of that leads to him sort of, unfortunately or fortunately, however you want to look at it, being given this name as his identity, right? And we know, because we know of Ashoka's experiences from prior and how significant this was for his life, we know that there's a tremendous amount of significance attracted to this. But Gogol, for his part, only sees it as the adolescent Gogol, only sees it as a particular, how do I want to say, trait of his father's favoritism of a particular author, right? And if you watch the film version, they shortcut this a little bit at several times where his father brings it up and he says something to the effect, yeah, I know, it was your favorite author, and indicating that, yeah, great, you've got a favorite author and you named me after it. The book plays it out a little bit more so that we get an understanding of, Gogol himself trying to understand, but really, not completely comprehending the significance that means for not only his father's life, but also his mother and their family life and their very existence. That train ride and the accident and everything that comes after is the onset really to who they are at this moment, including Gogol himself. All of that sort of encapsulated in that name, which brings him shame and which brings him, embarrassment. And later on, as he's a young adult and moving towards, middle life, we'll see that sort of surrounding shame and personal nature of that name played out in some ways that are very specifically designed for him to define how he sees himself. And I won't spoil that now at this point because that's in the second half of the book, but there's a fairly significant moment where somebody close to him does not recognize the personal nature of that name for him. That, coupled with the idea that when he goes to school, unlike Jhumpa Jhumpa Lahiri's real life experience, he chooses, right? His family gives him his good name, right? Finally settling on a good name that he can use out in the world. And he goes and he doesn't understand that. He says, well, I've always been Gogol. This is who I am. Please call me that. And so he, due to his teacher's reactions, to how he accepts his good name, is given his pet name by his teachers as a way that says, well, this is the name that he responds to. So, there's a lot of metaphor in there in terms of who one really is. But at a young age where there's he's very innocent and there's lots of the cultural world that hasn't been put upon him, he strips that away and seems to say, I don't understand. This is who I am. I don't respond to this new name, Nikhil, at this point anyway. So follow this throughout. Right, and understanding that you may read the entirety of the book this week, but we'll talk more about the second half next week. Follow this progression throughout. It's certainly a touchstone for all of the events that happen in Gogol's life as he begins to acculturate himself. Okay, something else that you can follow in different scenarios is prior to even Gogol entering the picture, when we have this story between Ashok and Ashima and their marriage and their immigration and the procedures, they're very formalized and they're very traditional, but they're coming into an America of the 1970s in which things are changing and cultures are beginning to merge and look forward. And we see clearly early on a focus on Ashima's loneliness. And in particular, if you look at the scene prior to Gogol's birth, she's very much alone in the house and then in the hospital. And it's contrasted in our minds and in her narration the way that this would look like if she was in her homeland in India and preparing to give birth. And it's very sterile and it's very, very unnatural to her and her perception, and it's played for this sort of contrast, juxtaposition of their two existences prior to the move and after the move. Now, as they grow in their family a little ways, what we begin to see is this formation of a pseudo-family by looking to the community. The aunts and the uncles step into the picture who are not, literal family members, but they seek each other out and they form this family that will sort of combat that loneliness. But if you want to look for another theme to sort of pick on throughout the entire narrative, it's this sort of different versions of loneliness that appear throughout, and it's almost as if Ashima's loneliness early on, which doesn't really go away. No, it's not a huge spoiler. Doesn't really go away throughout the novel. Might be sort of transferred and adapted in new ways onto Gogol, and you might watch that and see how that it progresses throughout the novel as well. The barriers that are set up, speaking back to this idea of generational gap and divisiveness and all these things, we see several of these barriers being set up through choices, right? And the first one happens to be in that moment where later on Gogol begins to define himself by this good name because he sees it as less embarrassing. He says, I will be Nico and we will Americanize it to Nick. Now, he doesn't literally say those things, but his choices convey that message. And so he distances himself from that very specific name choice that his father and mother gave to him for significant reasons, right? And that's a wall. It's an impediment that he sets up between the two. There's another moment where he chooses Yale over MIT. This again creates distance. It creates a divergence from his father. It sets up him on his own clear, independent path, which seems wonderful in a lot of ways, but it also seems to be a very conscious choice of driving a wedge fuller between generations. We'll also see, his specific embrace of American culture in a lot of ways. In the middle, towards the end of the novel, we're going to see him almost, it's kind of implied that he specifically is seeking out American girls for romantic relationships as a rejection of some of the things that represent his culture. And there's some shame in there, and there's some fear and some sort of rush to prove his Americanness. All of that combined in these choices that he's making, but ultimately leading to these barriers and obstacles being set up. And then lastly, at least for this point in the book, we're going to see through all of this some sort of slow recognition, not that he's ever mean-spirited completely, but there is a lot of ambiguity towards how he feels about his parents, and in particular his father. But there's a slow recognition and a slow draw to the significance of his father's own experience that begins to promise, a more sort of evolved understanding of who he is and what it means to be a second generation Indian American. And that's kind of where the book pushes towards in the middle. And of course we'll have some resolution and action after that, but we'll save that for next week's discussion. Remember that you do not have a reading response due this week. Your next reading response will be due next Friday, and it will be over the entirety of this book. So you'll probably want to take some of what we've discussed today and your first reactions to the reading and see how these things carry themselves out and might reappear in other parts of the book later on. And your reading response next week will be due at the typical time. So if you have any questions, let me know. If your questions are about when are my assignments coming back, the answers are very soon. I'm working on them. I'll continue working on them as soon as I shut the video off here. So those are coming. Stay with me on those. Let me know if you have any other questions, though, and take care. See you next week.